The federal government has promised $4.7 billion to New South Wales to help fund renewable energy infrastructure. We're in a cost of living crisis and our energy bills are sky high, and yet our governments think renewable energy is going to get out of this bind. Here's what they said at the press conference.
We have addressed short-term issues with price caps on gas and on coal, but in the medium and long term, we need to make sure we transition to a clean energy economy.
Joining me now is Alex Epstein, author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. This still, Alex, is presented as groundbreaking, but is it going to actually reduce our energy costs?
Well, the thing is, when you make these so-called investments in unreliable solar and wind, you not only have to pay for the unreliable solar and wind, but you also have to pay for the reliable grid, because solar and wind can go near zero at any given time. This is actually what we've been seeing in the US when you see solar and wind plummet when they're needed the most, during all of these winter events. So yeah, it's a really bad sign. I was looking at what Albanese was saying, and he's talking about, oh yeah, the reason prices are high is just because of the invasion of Ukraine, which really shows he's in denial or just ignorant about what's going on. Prices were rising well before that. And the basic cause is that people are artificially restricting the supply of fossil fuels. There's a big opportunity for Australia to take a leadership position, including in coal, but it seems determined to do the exact opposite, which bodes very poorly.
It does, and at that press conference last week, both the New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet and the Prime Minister kept mentioning the invasion of Ukraine as if that explained everything that's happening here. Never mind that those price increases were happening before the invasion. They think we've forgotten all that. I mean, why do our governments keep going down this path when we can see the results? We know what the results are, not just here in Australia, but in the UK, in Germany, in North America.
Well, it's often, unfortunately, hard for people to admit when they've been really wrong. And the anti-fossil fuel movement has been catastrophically wrong. They've been warning us of a climate catastrophe, but they've actually created a climate policy catastrophe, namely an energy catastrophe. They've artificially restricted the supply of fossil fuel, and therefore prices have gone up, and therefore we've been vulnerable to Russia. If we had liberated fossil fuel production here and in Australia and around the world, then it would be a huge opportunity when people don't want Russian oil and gas. But instead, we are very vulnerable because we've been anti-oil and gas and leaving it to Russia and creating this huge dependence. And it seems like, unfortunately, Albanese and others just want to continue this so that we're dependent on the next catastrophe.
And yet, despite this obsession with emission targets, we're seeing global coal use increase. Are there countries that are seeing the value of coal and turning their backs on renewable energy?
Well, you're seeing a desperation move. So, when you get in a kind of immediate crisis, you sort of do whatever you need to do. And an energy crisis is a very immediate crisis, particularly in winter, because people are cold and they can't warm their homes and the power stops working and this kind of thing. Now, what you're seeing perversely is that places like Germany are turning back to coal. But as we've talked about before, they're telling poor nations to not use coal in the first place. So they have this confidence that, we can revert to the things that we say we hate, but if you prevent others from acquiring them in the first place, then you've just made them impotent indefinitely. So it really shows just the lie that, Germany is using solar and wind. No, as soon as the going gets tough, they revert to coal, as they should. They just shouldn't have opposed it in the first place.
And of course, natural gas is now being demonised. So that's also probably seeing a higher reliance on coal, because gas has suddenly become public enemy number one, certainly in this country. Now, I want to talk to you about a tweet of yours that really shocked me about OpenAI, whose stated mission is to ensure that artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity. Well, it's censoring any posts that are pro-fossil fuels. Can you explain this to me? I mean, this looks like straight out censorship and suppression.
Well, it's definitely suppression. And so what a reader of mine pointed me to this, where he had run this query that said something, I forget the exact words, but like make an argument that the use of fossil fuels promotes human happiness, which I think I've made the definitive argument for this in Fossil Future. It's certainly something one can make an argument for. And what was interesting is OpenAI was making such arguments in the past, but this time it said, I'm prohibited from doing anything that supports the use of fossil fuels. And it said specifically use solar and wind. So it didn't even advocate nuclear. So it was like the pure climate catastrophe, pro-unreliable solar and wind agenda seemed to be somehow hard-coded in this. Now, I publicized this, and it got a huge amount of attention. Elon Musk responded, although, as is often the case, it wasn't very clear exactly what he was saying. Sam Altman said with OpenAI, he's the head of OpenAI, and he said this wasn't deliberate, but it did say, we are prohibited from doing this. And some other people ran tests and they got it to make arguments for fossil fuels. But there's clearly something in it where somehow it's saying you are not allowed to make an argument for fossil fuels in a global energy crisis, mind you, where people are dying for lack of fossil fuels. So this is really, it is not functioning as a remotely intelligently. We can say that. And it's functioning a lot like a standard, quote unquote, woke media outlet.
And we're already seeing that big tech censorship. We've seen with the Twitter files how debate about COVID restrictions was suppressed and censored. And do you suspect similar things are happening when you're looking at the energy sector, and not just with Twitter, but with Google, with YouTube, with Facebook? Have you experienced that yourself?
Well, I have a little bit of a different take on this, because I don't think of it as censorship, because these are private entities. Now, it is when the government is telling them to do something and forcing them, then I consider that censorship. But it is still irrational suppression of content. And when you have one of these platforms, and I have some experience in this field, like, you need to think carefully about your content policy, because you can't just say, oh, anyone can say anything at any time. That runs into problems, as Elon discovered after, I think, not thinking it through at all before saying, oh, I just want a free speech platform. And then he sort of discovered what that meant, and then he didn't know what to do with it. And then he said, we're not changing anything, and this kind of thing. So you need to think it through, but you really have to favor the open exchange of ideas. And as soon as you have something like, I prohibit a certain viewpoint from being expressed, that is very, very dangerous. I am much more in favor of coming up with solutions where you allow users to curate their experience and say, hey, I don't want to hear from that guy. For example, Elon Musk, until recently, had me blocked on Twitter for saying the Tesla is a good fossil fuel car. He unblocked me, I know. Well, I think that was a wise decision, but in either case, he has the right to do it. We should focus on individual curation, not suppressing ideas that are politically incorrect. And yes, I have been the victim of that, and it is not something I appreciate.
Oh, well, there you go. You've got the Twitter owner personally unblocking you. I think that is a good way to end 2022, and is responding to your tweets as well. Alex Epstein, always informative to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thanks, Rita. Happy New Year.